Hello, welcome to Meet Your District Supervisor. I'm Nona Melkonian, and we're here with Supervisor Scott Wiener from District 8, which includes the Castro and Upper Market, Buena Vista Heights, Twin Peaks, Diamond Heights, Glen Park, Noe Valley, and Eureka Valley. Supervisor Wiener started his first term this January, so he's new to the board. We're going to get to know him and talk about the toughest issues facing the city. Welcome, Supervisor. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Tell us a little about your background, where you grew up and went to school, and the kind of jobs you've had.
I grew up in the Philadelphia area in New Jersey, and went to school up and down the East Coast. I went to undergrad at Duke University and then law school at Harvard. After clerking for a judge, I came out here in 1997, and I've been here for the last 14 years. I've always lived in the Castro. I'm an attorney, so I started out in private practice at a private law firm doing complex commercial litigation, and then in 2002 I moved over to the San Francisco City Attorney's Office where I worked on the trial team doing trials for the city, handling my own cases and supervising a team of attorneys as well.
Why did you choose to live in San Francisco?
I had actually always assumed I would go back to the Philadelphia area since that's where my family is, but I was always interested by San Francisco in terms of what it is as a city, its culture, its amazing LGBT community, and so I came out here for a summer and just fell in love with it and ended up coming back.
And so what motivated you to get involved with politics?
I've been interested in politics since I was a kid. I worked on campaigns when I was a teenager. I was involved campaigning against Senator Jesse Helms when I was in college. But when I came out here, I wasn't really initially involved politically. I was involved more in community work, helping to build the LGBT community center, doing neighborhood work. And I eventually started doing some campaigns and gradually got more involved in Democratic Party politics. And in the Alice B. Toklas LGBT Democratic Club. And then ultimately in 2004, I ran for the Democratic County Central Committee and ended up chairing the committee. So it was a gradual process for me. And then by the time I started thinking about running for supervisor, it really made sense because of my involvement in the community and in politics.
What did you learn from campaigning for supervisor?
I learned a lot. I knocked on about 15,000 doors and just met a huge number of people, which is really the best way to learn about the neighborhood and about the city and what people want and what people's concerns are. And so I just feel like I know so much more than before I started campaigning.
Where do you place yourself on the political spectrum? Are you more to the left or closer to the right?
We're all far to the left on the national standard, and I'm a good liberal Democrat. I guess in the San Francisco little mini spectrum, I'm probably considered more middle of the road. But one thing about me is that I'm very independent when it comes to the issues, and I don't vote a party line, and I just judge each issue on its merits, and that's sort of how I am.
What do you feel are some of the biggest issues facing San Francisco right now?
Well, the budget is the most imminent issue, and we do have a structural budget deficit in the city, and so we need to deal, of course, with the short term of balancing our budget in a way that does not decimate basic city services that people rely on, but also to address our long-term structural budget deficit. And that means implementing some budget reforms that smooth out our budget process so it's not a boom-bust kind of budget. It means reforming our pension system and retiree healthcare system so that they're stable and that they don't drain the general fund. So that's a big aspect of it. Another huge issue confronting the city is the deferred maintenance on our infrastructure. We have a lot of infrastructure that's been deteriorating because we haven't maintained it properly, from our roads to our sewer system to Muni, and we need to be much, much more diligent about maintaining our infrastructure.
And what are some of the biggest issues facing your district right now?
Some of the big citywide issues really impact the district, like transportation. We have more Muni service than some other districts have, but it's not always reliable. We have big problems with the J Church. Some of the major bus lines in the district aren't reliable, so transportation is very important. We have some major projects coming up in the city, like the renovation of Dolores Park, which is a once in 50-year opportunity to define what the park is and what changes we want to make to it. So that's going to be a very significant project. Same with Glen Canyon, which is going to undergo a lot of work.
How will you balance the needs of your district versus the needs of the city as a whole?
That's one of the most challenging parts of being a district supervisor. We elect our supervisors by district, and it's very important to pay attention to the district, to be engaged in the projects in the district. But we also represent the whole city. And I think any district supervisor that just focuses on the district without addressing those big citywide issues is not doing his or her job. So every day I make sure that I'm working both on the major citywide issues and on district issues, and I try to be disciplined about that.
So once again, the city is faced with some tough budget decisions, including whether to make cuts and whether to increase taxes and fees. How will you approach these hard choices?
I think we have to start by looking at what are the most critical city services that we absolutely cannot do without, and the core services. There are a lot of services that are important, but what are the ones that if they deteriorate, we will all really pay the price? Public safety certainly falls in that category of basic critical city service. Transportation, making sure we have a functional Muni, again, very, very critical. Some core public health services, like making sure we're dealing with mental illness on our streets, as well as HIV services, those kinds of things that, again, if we don't provide those services, we're really going to pay the price. And then you work out from there, and that determines your budget priorities.
What are your ideas on dealing with the issue of homelessness?
It's twofold, and it's not just homelessness, it's really homelessness and general behavior on our streets. We need to make sure that people have access to services. So I was a supporter, for example, of Care Not Cash, to say let's take the money that we're putting into the system and actually try to provide housing for people. We need to make sure people have access to those kinds of services. We also need to make sure that we are having standards of behavior on our streets. And keeping in mind that most homeless people do not cause any problems on our streets, but there is a small group of people on our streets who are causing problems. And so we need to make sure that we have those standards of behavior, say that there are some kinds of behavior that are not okay, and then to enforce that.
You mentioned housing needs. So what are the city's housing needs, and how do you think the Board of Supervisors should address these needs?
There are a few different areas that we need to address. One is housing affordability or lack thereof is a major challenge for the city. It's harder and harder to afford housing in the city if you're a lower or middle income person, and so we need to address that. And I really want to focus on workforce housing. We do a pretty good job generating high-end housing, and we can always do better, but we do a decent job providing low-income housing. We do a terrible job providing housing for lower middle class and middle class people who are working and paying taxes and that we need to have here for a functioning economy. And so I'm looking for ways to try to fund more of that kind of housing, particularly for essential employees like teachers, nurses, first responders. We also need to make sure that our development is transit-oriented, that we're not encouraging suburban sprawl, and that we're doing what's called infill housing so that people can live near where they work and near public transportation.
So let's talk a little about public transportation. Is there adequate Muni service in your district right now, and how is the parking and traffic situation? Is it safe for pedestrians?
Muni is not where it needs to be in my district. We're lucky that we have, at least in the Castro, we have the subway, which can be terrific, but can also be frustrating when it's not as reliable as we'd like. And we also are next to the BART line if you happen to live near 24th Street or 16th Street BART. But in other parts of the district, it's very unreliable. The J Church is just a constant source of frustration for riders, and its ridership is, I think, lower than it would be otherwise because of its unreliability. Some of the core bus lines in the district, like the 24 to Visadero, are important lines, but they're not frequent enough, and so people don't think of using them. And then we have a particular problem in Diamond Heights, where the neighborhood is served primarily by the 52 line, which is incredibly unreliable. Buses miss runs. For a while, Muni was ending service at, I think, 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And so you have this neighborhood that's up on a hill, and that if it doesn't have adequate public transportation, it gets isolated. Another transportation issue that I'm working on is trying to get more taxis onto the street, because a world-class taxi system is a critical complement to any public transportation system.
So let's talk a little about crime in your district. How do you think the police department is doing, and do you have any thoughts on how the city is dealing with crime?
Well, in terms of the city as a whole, I was a big supporter of Chief Gascon when he was police chief, and although I think he's going to do a great job in the district attorney's office, part of me was sad to see him go from the police department, because he had come in and just started modernizing the department, its technology, civilianization, a lot of different changes that needed to happen but weren't happening, and he came in and started the department on the right path. It is critical that whoever the next chief of police is continue that modernization of the department, because that's going to have benefits citywide. In my district, we have public safety challenges. The district is often viewed as a quote-unquote safe district, and certainly compared to some neighborhoods in the city, we're fortunate. But we do have violence. We had a bunch of violence around Dolores Park last year. There have been on-again, off-again robberies in Glen Park and parts of Noe Valley. There have been some shootings up in Diamond Heights. And so one of our challenges is really making sure that the police department understands that even though we may not have the same crime levels as some neighborhoods, we still need attention from the police department.
So let's talk a little about the city's economic development. Are we on the right track? And what would you like to change about the city's approach to developing its economy?
Well, we're getting better. I think the city in the last number of years has gotten more proactive about attracting businesses and new industries here and providing incentives for them to come and to stay here. But it is still a very expensive place to do business in terms of the cost of labor, the cost of land. And one thing that we need to make sure is that we're not feeing and taxing businesses to the point that it's not profitable or not attractive for them to be here. We need to reform our payroll tax, which is an incentive not to create jobs. And I know that Board President David Chu is continuing to work on some possibilities there, and I look forward to working with him. I also support very targeted efforts to revitalize areas or to bring industries here, like the biotech payroll tax holiday, as well as the proposal that was introduced yesterday at the board relating to mid-market and parts of the Tenderloin to provide some payroll tax relief to encourage businesses like Twitter and others to go there.
Governor Brown has proposed eliminating funding for redevelopment agencies. What is your opinion of that plan, and what are your thoughts on the value of redevelopment agencies?
I think the plan is very overbroad, and I don't support it, at least as it relates to San Francisco's model of redevelopment. Our redevelopment agency does tremendous work in San Francisco, and a lot of projects like Treasure Island and some other very, like what's happening in Hunters Point, those kinds of projects would be very difficult to achieve without redevelopment. Our redevelopment agency is the largest source of affordable housing creation in the city, and it really has been a huge asset. I understand that there are other parts of the state where redevelopment is a different model that's not as positive, leading to creation of a lot of things like strip malls and other unwise kinds of development. And so redevelopment statewide is definitely in need of reform, but San Francisco is a model for redevelopment and it needs to stay intact.
So let's talk a little about the role of sports in the city's economic future. Are you happy with the plans for the America's Cup, and should the city spend money to keep the 49ers?
I'm thrilled about the America's Cup. It's going to be not just an economic boon to the city, and it will create a lot of jobs and long-term economic development, but it's going to help us shore up our aging and deteriorating piers. We have something like $1.5 billion of deferred maintenance on our piers, and anything that helps us clear some of that deferred maintenance is terrific. So I'm excited about it. It's also going to be a terrific promotion for the city. People are, for months, are going to see the panoramic views of San Francisco and are going to want to come here. In terms of the 49ers, I would very much like to see the 49ers stay here. What that means, we'll have to talk about it. I'm not a huge fan of massive public subsidies to sports teams, but I think we should work hard to keep the 49ers here.
Well, we're almost out of time, but before we go, are there any other issues or concerns that we haven't discussed, and are there any other specific interests or issues that you plan to concentrate on throughout your term as supervisor?
A couple that come to mind is first, yesterday I introduced rent control legislation to make it easier for tenants who are displaced by fires or earthquakes or other disasters to find below market replacement rents while their apartments are being fixed. Right now, there are some aspects of our rent control laws that make it difficult to find those kind of temporary accommodations at below market rents. And so I've been working with tenant groups and property owner groups on legislation that I introduced yesterday that'll help there. I also have requested an economic impact study to be performed on the entertainment and nightlife industry. It's a very important economic and cultural sector in our city, and I think we've never really taken a look at what it actually contributes to our economy, and I think that's an important piece of information to have to guide policymaking in the future. I've also requested a hearing on the impact of historic preservation on other important policy goals in the city, like creating affordable housing, having usable parks and libraries, et cetera, and to take a look at how those different policies interact with each other. So those are just a few things that I'm working on.
Well, it looks like we're all out of time.
Great.
So we're going to have to wrap this up, but thank you so much for joining us. And we've been talking to Supervisor Wiener from District 8. Thanks so much for joining us on SF Gov TV's Meet Your District Supervisor. Watch for the next episode of Meet Your District Supervisor, when we'll be back with another one of our 11 city supervisors. For SF Gov TV, I'm Nona Melkonian.